All right, so learning objective 4 in chapter 1 basically goes over some trends and concepts in managerial accounting that you will be exposed to in this book. There are actually some chapters that are totally devoted to a couple of these things. Others you'll just be hearing about them over and over and over again. But just because it's a service business, and we've been so far talking a lot about manufacturing, as this course will focus more on that, it doesn't mean that service industries don't use some of the same techniques that manufacturing firms do to make sure they're running efficiently and managing their costs well. So that's what this is going to sort of introduce you to a little bit. I don't know if you've ever flown Allegiant Airlines. I do fly them because my parents live down in Myrtle Beach area in South Carolina, and Allegiant flies right out of Newburgh here, so it's very, very close by, and they fly pretty cheap each way, assuming you don't take any clothes with you. You start bringing baggage and stuff like that. It gets a little bit more expensive, but I fly pretty light. So they basically have very, very cheap fares out of Newburgh. It's seasonal. You only go in the warmer weather to Myrtle Beach anyway. They're crazy profitable for a company that has really, really low fares. I can't talk about their situation this past year, which has been horrible for everybody. But in the past, as you see, this story runs the gamut from 2009 to 2013 in general. In the past, they had a really good moneymaker. Okay, how do they do it? Well, first of all, they have the highest profit margins of almost anyone in the airline industry, and that's hard to do because the average fare is only $83 one way. So how do you make money? It's all about your costs, getting those things under control. So first of all, they buy used planes versus the brand new ones. They cost a lot less, and thus that lowers their payment obligations for those particular planes, because they do borrow money to buy these assets. They also fly out of very small towns. And so, Newburgh isn't really known for the airport that's there, but the airport is there and it's quite functional. So therefore, they don't have to pay very high fees to be in that airport. The wages are relatively low compared to being out of LaGuardia or JFK or Newark. And there's no competition there, or very little competition. They often don't necessarily need to keep their crews in hotels overnight because they have usually a set schedule. So they kind of use local crews that fly out, fly back, fly out, fly back during the same day. So they start at home and they end up at home. The company will only fly if its airplanes, which average about 150 passengers, are at least 90% full. And thus they're flying at a profit. And so, this is the bottom line. They know their costs down to the penny, and they're making good profits. Again, I can't talk about any airlines this past year, which has been a disaster for them. But this has been the past for Allegiant, and they do pretty good. Like I said, I have flown them a number of different times out of Newburgh to Myrtle Beach, and it's been fine, no issues. All right, this chapter also introduces you to the value chain. And let's see here. I have a comment. During COVID, Allegiant was flying much less than 90. Yes, actually all the airlines were, for sure. Yeah, still are. They still are, and they will for a while. But this was the model that they've used so successfully. What that story was about. Again, good story. All right, so the value chain here is really about all the processes associated with getting a product or a service to you. All right. And so for a manufacturing company, it all starts with research and development. It all starts with the creation of a product, right? That's really this part here. This is the starting point, the creation. Then they need the raw materials. They need to do production of those goods. They need sales and marketing to get those goods into various locations. They have to make sure things are delivered appropriately, and that chain, that logistics work out quite well. And then, of course, they have to make sure they have very good customer relations and any other services the customers might need. Um, in this case, the customer would be sort of a retail company. And so this is the value chain for the most part. And it's, again, a lot of business processes that are involved to get a product from an idea into maintaining those relationships in the stores that they're sold in. Almost the entire industry, and actually all industries in manufacturing or retail, have gone to what they consider a just-in-time inventory system, which basically they are not producing mass amounts of inventory until they know the sales are imminent. So they basically want to produce it just in time to sell it. They don't want to have much of these things in storage. They don't want a backlog of this material. They just want to make sure whatever they get, they're processing and it's sold. And it's sold. So there's nothing left. There's less. It's very efficient to think of it this particular way. What you saw in the past 12 months is a breakdown in that particular system because we were so hooked on just-in-time inventory that when the pandemic hit and a huge demand went for protective personal equipment and other types of things, they just didn't have any in stock, and so they had to make things from scratch. The problem is when you're making things from the get-go, you need to rely on a whole bunch of suppliers. You need the raw materials, you need labor to be there, you need everything to kind of work in order for that system to work. And when countries and places closed down, people got sick, other types of things, that system had a lot of holes in it. And so suppliers became not dependable because they couldn't get things there in time quickly. The labor force took huge hits because COVID was everywhere. It still is everywhere. So people get sick, can't go to work. There were restrictions, etc. All put a lot of pressure on this particular system. So we still, most companies are still using just-in-time inventory methods. But I think there's going to be a few changes with more critical components that we need in cases of emergencies like this made here. And because our inventory system is global. And we rely on various countries and to do various things as part of that value chain. And with the pandemic, of course, that really showed the weaknesses there. Another thing that businesses are more and more committed to, even the service business, but for the most part, this starts as manufacturing, is something called TQM, Total Quality Management. It starts in manufacturing because at the beginning, this was kind of pioneered by Toyota and several Japanese companies that said, look, what we want is we want to produce stuff with zero defects. We want to make sure that our products come out with nothing wrong with them. So our customers are incredibly satisfied that they have something very reliable when they buy something from us. They know when they buy it from us, we've made it so good with no defects, it's always going to work for them. And so this is really what gave very early in this, really in the 70s, 80s, and beyond. Really what gave Japanese and German automakers really kind of an edge on US automakers at that time was that they were really committed to improving those processes and putting in place a system of manufacturing that produced products with no defects. Because if you have no defects, you're going to have a very strong, reliable product that people look at as very dependable. And I think, particularly in the auto industry, that's what you want. You want to go to your car uh, and you want it to start right away and get you wherever you're going. And if it does that over and over and over again, you have something very dependable, very reliable. And they were the first ones to kind of do that. But TQM is used all across the floor now in basically all different types of industries. It's still manufacturing based, but there's certain things that we can do even in the service area to make sure that things are coming out with top quality. All right, a couple of other things here. The theory of constraints really looks at the processes of getting things done and where the bottlenecks are. And a bottleneck is basically a place where things kind of back up, slow things down, and stop things from happening in an efficient way. So the focus there is to focus on those bottlenecks, get those constraints worked out so things are running more smoothly. And so that's a theory of constraints here. What helps businesses look at the bigger picture, being more holistic in its approach, looking at all the processes, is to use software that basically gives the information to managers on how things are working all the way through. So enterprise resource planning, ERP, is basically a management tool um, through software that gives a big picture of how things are going. Most of the time, we're very stuck on what's happening in our department, and we don't often see the connections to other departments and the picture as a whole, how the company works as a whole. And so this is supposed to look at things in a more holistic view, seeing how we're all connected in getting a product produced and out the door, and making things flow a lot easier. So it becomes more efficient. If it's more efficient, it's going to lower the cost. There's going to be a whole chapter. Chapter 4 is going to be is devoted to what's called activity-based costing, ABC, and that looks at each specific activity that's used to produce something and allocates cost, particularly overhead costs, based on the activity itself. Some activities take a longer time than other activities when you're making a product. And so if it takes longer at this activity, then the cost for that activity is more than an activity that just is relatively simple. Prior to this, they would just simply spread the cost out evenly. What activity-based costing says is no. If we identify the activity and how long it's taking and what type of a time of the process it is, we can allocate the costs even better, because now we can locate those high cost activities and work on making those better. So ABC is, again, chapter 4 is dedicated to this whole thing. You're going to love it. All right. The balanced scorecard approach is basically, most managers have been judged in the past on almost solely financial measures on whether they're doing quite well. Companies are also judged by financial measures, and that was more of the emphasis for a long time. Are you profitable? Are you profitable? Are you profitable? Well, the balanced scorecard looks at things a little bit different. Like, well, you actually need to look at, yes, the financial measures of the company are very, very important, but that's not everything. That's not the best way we can measure how the company is doing. We actually look at financial and non-financial measures to really get a really big idea of how we're doing in general, how we're managing things, how the company is doing overall. So in a future chapter, we will read more detail about the balanced scorecard approach. Oh, yes, ethics. Gotta love them, right? Um, Business ethics, it's hard to teach, and I said this many times. I think it's very, very difficult to teach people ethics because you already sort of know right from wrong from a very, very young age onward. You're taught this is the right thing to do. This is not a good thing to do. Don't do it. That doesn't change when you become an adult. You still have ideas of right and wrong and so forth and so on. I think one of the biggest issues in business is that we often view ethical decisions um, in a way that is tainted by financial issues. So if managers are supposed to make the company profitable, um, then shouldn't they, by all means, make decisions solely based on making the company profitable, even if it means putting employees at risk or selling a bad product to customers or things like this. So that was, a very prominent ethos in the business world for many, many years and still exists. It's still part of the business world. But now it's being balanced by, well, you know, we have to look at things a little bit differently. It's good to have ethical decision making and looking at all different aspects. Um, and so there are codes of ethics that all businesses have, or most businesses do. The purpose of this is to prevent fraud. And what fraud does is totally ruin the confidence in, particularly if it's a public corporation, the confidence in that particular corporation to exist. So, we had past struggles like Enron and WorldCom, the parent of NCI, that basically, failed financially. They lied to their owners and to the public about how they were doing, and these frauds basically were perpetuated by upper management as well. And so, of course, those companies don't exist anymore. They certainly went out of business, but a lot of people got hurt from them. Thankfully, Congress, on occasion, Congress can do some really good things. And one of the things they did was pass the Sarbanes-Oxley Act to put real legal penalties and jail time to executives and directors of corporations that perpetuate frauds, like what happened with Enron and WorldCom. And so they have to make sure that there are various controls in the system to promote the ethics. Okay. And we're going to be looking, because you kind of had this introduction to controls and systems way back in chapter 7 of financial accounting when you looked at internal control. It just gets more detailed and as you keep going. The incentive should be to have managers do the right thing by the company and by everybody else. However, the way the systems are set up is it's creates incentives for the managers to make decisions that are unethical that end up hurting the people or the planet or other things. So that has to, and that's been a focus. Again, Sarbanes-Oxley, as I mentioned, last thing, this basically, for the first time, the government said, look, this is really one of your responsibilities to make sure that you are not producing fraudulent information and putting that out there to your owners and the public. Now, because these were public corporations, which means they had stock, anybody in the public could become an owner. And the information that they did put out there was a fraud, was fraudulent, was lying. For the first time, it requires that the CEO, CFO, and certain boards of director members actually sign off on the financial statements as being accurate to the best of their knowledge, as accurate as possible. Also, board of directors have been affected because they have to have at least a financial professional on their audit committee that oversees those statements before they're released to the public. And it substantially increased penalties, including jail time. And of course, there's always been fines, but to a very wealthy person, a fine may not really matter all that much, but jail time probably does. So for the first time, the fines were increased and now lots of jail time were added. So that got people's eyebrows attention. Social responsibility, you've had this discussion back in Foundations of Business course and so forth. Basically, it's really important to understand that corporations have gone from just their sole responsibility is to make a profit so they can become profitable, employ more people, and that way they're doing good, to a view where it's a bit more, well, actually, it is still about profit, but it's also about people and it's also about the planet. And thus, it's not just bottom line money, bottom line, it's actually bottom line profit, bottom line planet, bottom line people. Sort of the three P's of social responsibility. And businesses need to make sure that they have sustainable business practices, and so things that something that's sustainable can last indefinitely into the future, right? And so when something is insustainable or unsustainable, it can't last. So our dependence on the planet's dependence on oil and its effects on the temperature of the earth is unsustainable, right? It's not a sustainable practice. And so there's calls for changes there with green practices. But here it's sort of that, but it has all these other types of things attached to it as well. Okay, welcome to our Do It exercise at the end of Learning Objective 4. You have a whole bunch of terms that you just learned little bit about. And what you've got here is some definitions. So when you look at all activities associated with providing a product, that's going to be your value chain. Okay. When you have a method of allocating overhead based on the product's activity, that's your activity-based costing, ABC as they call it. Systems that are implemented to reduce defects with the goal of achieving a 0 defects in products is, excuse me, your total quality management. Performance measurement approach that uses both financial and non-financial measures is what we're going to call the balanced scorecard. An inventory system in which goods are manufactured when they're needed is what just-in-time inventory is about. A company's efforts to employ sustainable business practices regarding to people, planet, and society in general is what we call corporate social responsibility. And an inventory system which goods are manufactured as they are needed. Does that happen to be? That's not wrong. That's not correct. I think they basically, someone made a boo-boo on the slide. Oh, quick, someone called Riley. You want your money back. But it's this actually is just in time, but I think they put the wrong definition in there, hey? Ah, what we learned with Wiley. It's amazing, huh? Woo! All right, so I'm going to ask for questions on that.